That's quite the gospel to say, praise to you, O Christ, afterwards, huh? I mean, usually on Christ the King Sunday, you think of a pretty simple message, right? God wins, yay! I actually even once threatened as a joke to write a 7-page paper on basically summarizing all of everything, and I was going to make a font really, really big and put a G on page 1, an O on page 2, a D on page 3, and then end up with 7 pages that just said, God wins. I didn't go through with that one. There were several other practical jokes that I played on a professor, but that wasn't one of them. The trouble is that our text today doesn't really talk about that aspect of Christ's eternal reign. Instead, it focuses on something that we tend to say in the creeds every week, but probably don't really pay much attention to. He will come again to judge the living and the dead. And sometimes his kingdom will have no end. It depends on which creed it is, I think. I always get thrown off, especially when we get to this time of year and we start switching between the creeds. I can never remember which one is which. So unless I'm reading them, it's game over. I'll add stuff into the Apostles' Creed that's in the Nicene. I'll leave stuff out. It's just bad. But we don't really talk about this. We don't like to talk about judgment. Judgment is a scary word. We don't like to think that God's going to judge people. In fact, we spend a whole lot of time saying that God isn't going to judge people. We spend a whole lot of time saying that we're forgiven, and it's great and it's wonderful that we're forgiven. That doesn't get us out of judgment. And that's kind of what Jesus is saying today. There's very clear messages in Ezekiel and Matthew that God is going to judge his people. He will judge between one sheep and another, between rams and goats. He will judge between the fat sheep and the lean sheep, Ezekiel says to us. Now, over the past several years, I've had the joy of watching sheep be judged. Now, I know absolutely nothing about what a good sheep looks like, but these judges, they do. They have an ideal sheep in their head. And if your sheep fits the ideal sheep, then you do well. If your sheep doesn't fit their ideal sheep, it doesn't really matter how good your sheep is, because it's not what that judge thinks a sheep should be. Now, my idea of an ideal sheep is the one that's cooked up on a plate and delicious. But, that's why I don't judge the sheep. I just eat the sheep. Although at that point it becomes mutton, because English is a wonderful language. So these people, they have this idea of what a perfect sheep is. And in a way, God has a similar idea of what his sheep look like. He has specific things that he's looking for, just like the judge of the sheep competition. And Jesus has some very straightforward and interesting criteria that he's going to use to judge us by. And it's really simple, and he's told it to us over and over again, and yet we still manage to keep messing it up. So criteria number 1, it's really laid out in Matthew 7, but it comes up in a whole lot of other places. Starting at verse 21 of Matthew 7, Jesus says, "Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons and perform many miracles?' Then I will tell them plainly, 'I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.'" Now for me, that pretty much lays out criteria number 1. Do you know Jesus? Simple, pretty straightforward, right? If you don't know Jesus, everything else is out the window. If you do know Jesus, then we move on to criteria number 2. We don't like to move on from this point, by the way. We like criteria number 1. We like saying, I know Jesus, I'm good. But that would completely ignore today's gospel text. And that tends to lead us to some problems. Because in today's gospel text, Jesus is separating the sheep and the goats. And notice that the sheep and the goats all know who he is. I always found that interesting, that the sheep and the goats both know Jesus. They have a conversation with him. You definitely get this sense. And so he says to the sheep group first. Once he's got his sheep group and his goat group, he says, "Hey, sheep, Come on in. You guys looked after me when I was hungry. You looked after me when I was thirsty. You looked after me when I was a stranger. You looked after me when I needed clothes. You looked after me when I was sick. You looked after me when I was in prison. Thank you. Come on in. At that point, the sheep group goes, what? What do you mean we didn't do all these things for you. We never saw you in this condition. And then, of course, Jesus says, well, whatever you did to the least of these, you did to me. And then the poor goat group, Jesus says, hey, goat group, got some bad news for you. We're going to need you to come in on Saturday. Oh, wait, wrong bad news. Sorry. You guys didn't look after me when I was hungry. You didn't give me water when I was thirsty. You didn't take care of me when I was sick. You didn't visit me when I was in prison. Guess what? You get to go to eternal punishment. Now, of course, the goat group asks the same question as the sheep group. Lord, when did we see you in any of these circumstances? And of course, Jesus says, well, whatever you didn't do to the least of these, you didn't do to me. All of these groups, the sheep and the goats, had each passed test number 1. They all knew Jesus. But they missed out on test number 2. They missed out on doing the stuff that Jesus said to do. Did you know that in the Old Testament there are 2 things that the people of Israel are consistently told that they're doing wrong? We're running into this in adult Sunday school right now. There are 2 things that they're consistently yelled at for doing. One is they're not following God, and 2 is they're not taking care of the poor. Over and over and over again, the Israelites are yelled at for this. And wait, what are the 2 most important commandments? The first one's easy. I always remember that one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, and soul. And what's the second one? What's the second one? Is it go to church every Sunday? No, that's not right. Give money. Okay. I know it's right there. I got it. It is, help me out here, guys. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. And then, of course, the guy who asked the question in the first place goes, well, but who's my neighbor? And the answer to that question is anybody who crosses your path. This is where Christ's reign begins. Looking at his people going, did you know me? Did you do what I told you to do? I think this is why before Paul starts to celebrate Christ's eternal reign in Ephesians, he prays that they would have a spirit of wisdom and revelation so that you may know him better, and that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened in order that you may know the hope to which he has called you and the incomparably great power for us who believe. It's that reminder that we're called to follow Jesus and do what he said to do, to love God and to love our neighbor. Barely a chapter later in Ephesians, Paul says something wonderful that we only tend to read half of. It is by grace that you have been saved and not by faith, lest anyone should boast. To do the work that God has prepared for you to do. So today, when we celebrate Jesus' eternal reign over us, don't forget that he is the judge. He is the one who will judge the living and the dead. Remember that our call today is not just to rejoice that we know Jesus, but to follow in his footsteps, to love God and love our neighbor, to serve those who are in need, as if they were Christ himself. And in doing so, hear that wonderful invitation into eternal life.